Hello everybody and welcome back to the Halo Chronicle. Today's video is part 1 in my First Strike series. Halo First Strike is one of my favorite Halo books. It tells the story of what took place between Halos 1 and 2. You wouldn't think much happened between these games, but in actuality quite a lot happened. To help give this story the proper context, I'm going to recount the stories detailed in Halo: The Fall of Reach and Halo: The Flood. That journey starts with today's video. Let's jump into it. After the firing of the Halo array, it took humanity 97,000 years to recover their strength. In this time, humanity would once again become a spacefaring race. With time, they would even create advanced technology that would allow them to travel through slipspace. Their influence would begin to spread across the Orion arm of the Milky Way. Humanity would settle and establish colonies on new worlds. To help maintain order, humanity would establish a unified governing body called the UEG, or Unified Earth Government. Humanity began to expand into the stars at a rapid pace. Perhaps they expanded too quickly. After a period of time, many humans in the outer colony worlds would begin to resent the influence of those who resided in the inner colonies. The outer colonies also began to outnumber the inner colony worlds. As such, the outer colonies believed their interests were not properly being represented. The inner colonies began to fear that they were losing control of the outer colonial worlds. During humanity's expansion into the stars, the inner colonies became more reliant on the outer colonies' resources. To maintain control of the outer colonies and their resources, the inner colonies would level heavy taxes and sanctions. They also established the UNSC, or United Nations Space Command, to protect Earth and all of her colonies. These measures did not reduce the resentment that the outer colonies felt towards the inner colonies. In fact, it only strengthened it. The resentment grew to anger, and anger led to rebellion. Rebellions began popping up all over human-controlled space. At first, they were random and very unorganized, but after time, these rebel forces of the outer colonies would begin to coordinate. Eventually, these forces would unite and form the United Rebel Front, or URF. Working together, these forces would begin staging acts of terrorism all across the universe. In response, the UEG would deploy the UNSC to stop this rebellion before it continued to spread. This unofficial civil war would be called the Insurrection. The UNSC would attempt to quell rebel forces all across the universe, but the URF would not go quietly. They would use major conflicts and acts of war by the UNSC as propaganda to recruit new soldiers to their cause. Due to the guerrilla tactics of the URF, this insurrection would last over 100 years and had shown no signs of stopping. To help understand the threat they faced, the UNSC would have their special investigative team, called the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, conduct studies. ONI's studies would reveal that the likely outcome of this civil war would be catastrophic for humanity. They predicted that the insurrection had a significant chance to collapse human civilization within the next few decades. With these findings, the top brass of the UNSC became desperate. In the UNSC's desperation, they would approve a highly secret, experimental ONI project. This ONI project would be called Spartan-II. This program would focus on creating specially trained and augmented super soldiers. This program would not be the first of its kind. Previously, ONI had tried another experiment called the Orion project, which failed due to issues with older candidates. To make sure that there are no issues with this new program, the candidates of this program would be selected at a young age. These candidates would also have to have a set of specific genetics. An ONI scientist and civilian named Dr. Catherine Halsey would be put in charge of this program. The Spartan-II program would have room for 75 candidates. Dr. Halsey took charge of the selection process. The Spartan-II program would screen and gather 75 candidates that were personally screened by Dr. Halsey. These candidates would be kidnapped and replaced with flash clones. These flash clones would die shortly after and erase all evidence of ONI's crimes. To help screen these candidates, Dr. Halsey would be allowed to choose one UNSC officer to escort and assist her. She would select Lieutenant Jacob Keyes, Keyes earned a reputation through his training. In his training, his commanding officer attempted a cryosleep experiment. This experiment would go awry and resulted in many of Keyes' fellow officers being killed or badly burned by plasma. The officer in charge was put on trial, but Keyes refused to testify against him. Keyes' ability to keep a secret would be the main reason Dr. Halsey would select him for this task. Even though she trusted him, she would keep many of the key elements of this project hidden from Keyes. Dr. Halsey and Keyes would pose as a married couple and visit many schools the Spartan-II candidates would attend. The first colony they would visit would be Eridanus-II. This first candidate that they would screen would receive the code name John 117. After observing and speaking to this 6-year-old boy, Dr. Halsey would select him to join the Spartan-II program. Little did she know it at the time, but John 117 would become humanity's greatest champion. Sometime during the selection process, Keyes would be made aware of the truth of this screening process. This made Keyes very uncomfortable with continuing with this program. Dr. Halsey had him reassigned to active duty at his request. One by one, each candidate was vetted until all 75 slots were filled. As planned, the children were kidnapped by Oni operatives and replaced with Flash clones. The children were then put into cryosleep and sent through slipspace. Eventually, all 75 candidates were brought to Planet Reach and the Epsilon Eridani system. Planet Reach was a military hub for all UNSC forces, and as such was the perfect training ground for these candidates. Each of these candidates would be awoken from cryosleep and taken to an auditorium. Dr. Halsey would be there waiting for these candidates. Many of the candidates were frightened and scared by their new surroundings. Dr. Halsey had two options when it came to telling the children why they were there. Her first option would be to lie and tell the children that their parents were killed by insurrectionists. She refused this option, as if the children would discover the truth about this lie later, they would turn against the UNSC. She would go with another option and tell them the truth. She would tell them that they were called upon to serve. They were selected to become the protector of Earth and all of her colonies. Many of the children would go from frightened to generally curious about the prospect of becoming the Earth's mightiest protectors. This would affirm that Dr. Halsey had indeed selected the right candidates for this monumental task. Over the next 10 years or so, these children would be molded into some of the greatest champions in human history. This is going to conclude the first chapter of this story. I hope you guys enjoyed today's story. Before I close things out, let's talk about some interesting Halo lore tied to today's video. When Halsey met John 117 on Eridanus-II, she tested him. She brought with her a coin. This coin was a US quarter, which was considered to be very rare at the time. She flipped the coin and asked John what side it would land on. John correctly guessed the eagle side. He was then gifted the quarter. Halsey wasn't sure if John saw the correct side when the coin was flipping, or if he willed it into existence. This was the first instance of John 117's remarkable luck. The UNSC was not humanity's first attempt to organize and lead all of the human forces. The CMA, or Colonial Military Authority, was originally created to organize and rally human forces from both the inner and outer colonies. Over time, the CMA began to grow empathy for the plight of the outer colonies. Due to this empathy, the CMA was dissolved and the UNSC would assume their role. The insurrection was like a quickly growing fire. The UNSC forces would engage rebel forces in one colony, and after that conflict ended, another conflict would escalate in another system across the galaxy. These tactics were effective and kept the UNSC on its toes for much of the war. This led the UNSC to perform studies that would eventually result in the creation of the Spartan-II program. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing. If you want to help the channel grow, share and comment on these videos. Next week's episode will provide a lot more detail about the Spartan-II program. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.